The 2025 Global Bushcraft Symposium was held this year in Sweden, and I was one of the key speakers. If this is your first time hearing about the GBS, the Global Bushcraft Symposium, then you might be wondering what it is exactly. The Global Bushcraft Symposium is an international gathering to promote bushcraft, survival and traditional skills instruction through the open exchange of philosophies, teaching methods and dissemination of best practices within these fields. Now, that might seem like it's only open to instructors or professionals. It isn't. It's open to anyone with a strong interest in these areas, and all of the organisers encourage students of these subjects, whatever their level, who are enthusiastic to extend and deepen their understanding in these areas to attend any of the Global Bushcraft Symposium events. Now, the 2019 symposium was in Canada with the theme Skills in Context. The 2022 symposium was in the UK with the theme Lifelong Learning. And the organisers of the 2025 symposium chose the theme The Nordic Way. We started the 2025 symposium with a handover from the 2022 GBS organising team, which I co-chaired along with Dr. Lisa Fenton, and I handed over to Johan Skulman, who then made an introductory speech. The first key speaker on the first full day was Dr. Lisa Fenton, who made a presentation in the morning, and the title of her presentation was Bushcraft, Survivalism and the Nordic Way, Reimagining Human-Nature Relationships in a Changing World. Then, in the evening of the first day, I was the next key speaker. As always, it's a privilege to speak at these events, and here I will share the same presentation with you. Johan Skulman, the organiser of the 2025 Global Bushcraft Symposium, asked me to take the slot of inspirational talk. But also, similar to what he asked Dr. Lisa Fenton, he also asked me to make some outside observations about the Nordic Way, the theme of the 2025 GBS. This was because of my experiences there in the Nordic countries and what I also see reflected in the wider bushcraft world. So here I will provide some personal reflections, particularly around aspects of the Nordic Way that have been influential and inspiring to me, and I hope you also find some inspiration here. When I was in Alberta, Canada, earlier in 2025 on a winter camping trip, one day I made a series of short videos for my YouTube channel about the winter clothing I like to use. In this screenshot, you can see Jonkangen boots, Hestra gloves, Lil Sport overboots, Vuota or Sami shoe bands or trouser wraps, and a hat that was sent to me from Finland. Underneath my outer layers, I have Swedish Wool Power thermal layers, and my extra warm pullover that I wasn't wearing that day, it's in my pack. That's by Devold of Norway. Also, I had with me a Swedish M90 parka. Here, I'm camping on an island during a canoe trip in Ontario, Canada in 2017. I'm wearing a Swedish M59 cotton shirt. I'm wearing Fjällräven trousers, and we were sleeping in a Hilleberg tent. Closer to home in the UK, these are the tools I typically hand out to my students on foundational bushcraft courses: a Barco Laplander saw, a Morokniv companion knife, and a Swedish fire steel. Last year, in 2024, my Wilderness Axe Skills book was published in German, 3 years after it was first published in English. The English version has done very well, both on the North American side of the Atlantic and on the British side of the Atlantic. People like it across the board, and there are hundreds of English reviews on Amazon. By contrast, the only review on the German Amazon site complains that all the axes pictured in the book are Swedish. Indeed, here is one image used in the book, and there are Hultafors, Gransfors and Vetterlings axes here. Even the basic tools I use for sharpening these axes are a Barco file, Gransfor, Brook, axe stone and a Falkniven DC4 pocket stone. So, could all this be down to clever, highly effective marketing of these Scandinavian and more broadly Nordic products? Maybe. But for some of the products, marketing will be responsible to an extent, of course, but you also need to have an established industry, a good product, and for people like me, or you perhaps listening to this, to use them, they have to perform well and be reliable, enduring the rigors of outdoor life. Otherwise, I certainly wouldn't use them. There's a lot of garbage outdoor products out there that we don't use. Further, in terms of my personal usage of many of these items, it comes down to me having been introduced to them in Scandinavia, and I've been there quite a lot. There've also been wider Nordic influences, both direct and indirect. This is one of the reasons we are all at the Global Bushcraft Symposium at this event. It's not the only reason, but it's certainly a strong factor. This scanned document is courtesy of Tom Lutyens, retired US Air Force survival instructor. It's a list of speakers at the 1995 International Survival Instructors Conference held in Jukkasjärvi, Sweden, and it includes Tom himself, but there's also Lars Falt, who was one of the main organisers of that event, Ray Mears, Mors Kahansky, Sean McBride, Mel Deweese, and many others, Turkka Aaltonen from Finland, and so on and so forth. And as you may know, our lead organiser of the 2025 Global Bushcraft Symposium, Johan Skulman, was a participant in the 1995 event 30 years ago. It was Lars Falt, commander of the Swedish Army Survival Unit, who brought all these people together. Lars is one of the grandfathers of modern survival training, especially in Sweden, but his influence has been much broader, particularly because of his collaborative nature and a willingness to learn from others and to share what he has learned. This is a scan of one of the pages of one of Lars's books, and the fire techniques that you can see here are adopted and adapted from various places, including Sami culture, as well as old woodcraft books. Here in the second sample page is an improvised snowshoe or ski shoe, a method that came from the lineage of Tom Roycraft and Mors Kahansky in Canada, and they're all illustrated beautifully by Alf Lanneback, of course, which brought the essence of these techniques and the way people would be feeling when using them to life in his amazing and brilliant illustrations. Here is the Roycraft snowshoe on a Karamat winter course in Alberta, Canada, demonstrated by Kelly Harlton, who was running the course. When I attended this course with some of my colleagues from Frontier Bushcraft, we had asked him to show us various binding methods, and he spent quite some time doing so. And of course, we all made our own set of snowshoes. Connections were deepened at the 2019 Global Bushcraft Symposium in Alberta, Canada, and I was honoured to have been asked to give a keynote speech there, and it was an amazing event, and there were countless introductions and interactions, conversations with elders and up-and-coming instructors, as well as a range of enthusiasts. Here, though, I want to point out that there were a number of people who were involved in the 1995 conference: Mors Kahansky, Lars Falt, Tom Lutyens and Johan Skulman on this panel discussion. And in the centre is John MacArthur, who chaired a panel discussion, and an audio recording is on my website if you're interested. I first met Lars in 2003 when I took a course with him in northern Sweden, organised by Ray Mears' company Woodlaw. I'd already done quite a lot of courses with Ray Mears in the UK at this point. That's him in the background actually, but Lars was front and centre in teaching this course. Here he's explaining a type of improvised shelter in the background to the right. This course was held between Gällivare and Kiruna, about 125 kilometres north of the Arctic Circle, and we learned a whole range of appropriate contextual skills for that environment, right from basic bivvying out in cold temperatures in so-called snow graves, to ice fishing, here catching a burbot, that's laka in Swedish, it's a type of freshwater cod, water generator bags, and lots of other skills, some of which I will come back to later in this presentation. For me, it was an inspirational course, extending bushcraft skills into winter survival and bushcraft skills in an environment where they make absolute sense. And I found this course so inspirational that I took the same course again the next year. I went back and did it again, and there's me in that photograph. Something else happened on that first course too. There wasn't much snow that year. It was in March and there hadn't been a lot of snow over the winter, and it was already starting to melt by that point in March. So we couldn't build quinsies, the snow shelter type where you pile up snow, let it freeze, and then burrow into it to create a sheltered space inside. So we had to build other types of shelters, one of which kind of had a snow base and then a teepee top. But it was quite similar to a shelter that I had made on a recent course that I'd done with Ray Mears in the fall of 2002. And so I asked him if we could do something different. I said I'd never built a lean-to. I certainly had never built one in the boreal forest like this. And so he said, yep, fine, your group can do that as long as you make a good job of it. And indeed, he actually ended up taking photos for one of his books of the shelter. But this led me to having a conversation with Ray Mears when we were traveling back. We were waiting for our connecting flight at Stockholm Airport and having a coffee, and he came over and said, would I like to assist on some of his UK courses, which I then started doing that spring in 2003. So that was also a gateway, that course, that was a gateway for me to start working part-time with Woodlaw and with Ray Mears. And fast forward, it ultimately led to working every year with Lars on the winter courses too. In his introductory talk at the beginning of the 2025 Global Bushcraft Symposium, Johan Skulman mentioned repetition, also repetition with variation. This is what, as a coach, I call varied practice. And an example would be, say, for example, I'm teaching you how to make eddy turns in a canoe where you're coming out of flow into static water, crossing the eddy line. We could practice that tens, if not hundreds of times in the same spot, and you would get pretty good at making that eddy turn. But then when we went further down the river and you presented with another eddy, perhaps with different speed of flow, different angle between the flow and the eddy's maybe deeper or shallower, maybe it's got a more powerful eddy line, you wouldn't do as well. Your performance would drop off quite significantly because it's providing something that's different. So if we practiced a bit on the first one, a bit on the second one, and then continued to have still eddy turn practice in and out of the eddy, but made a point of practicing on a range of different eddies, then you would be getting varied practice, and you would get better overall at making eddy turns, and you would also be better at making your own decisions without someone like me as an instructor being there. So that's the value of varied practice. It's really, really important to start making the skills your own and be able to use them with the variability that you're presented with in the real world. And working with Lars on winter courses added repetition, and the nature, the environment each year as it varied from one year to the next provided variation. And so this was a very valuable experience for me in working on these courses with Lars. It also introduced me to other expertise, such as that of Bertil Wenstrom. He used to come in to run a session on making ptarmigan snares. There is such a thing as a Swedish ptarmigan snaring license, and Bertil would come in and run the same course that he would run for Swedish nationals. He's part of the local hunting association. He would come in. It was a classroom session on all the rules and principles around ptarmigan snaring, and then we would go out and the students would do a practical session where they would set up a ptarmigan snare setup, and Bertil would come along and check it and test the snares. And so it was a great opportunity to meet people like Bertil as well working on these courses, because he wasn't involved in the courses that I did as a student. He started being involved in the courses later on when I was working with Lars. Lars would also show things he didn't normally show on the course, often as a result of a question from a student. So, for example, here he's showing quite a simple way of making a signal fire, and particularly with the temperature of the air being quite low, this simple setup was really very effective at punching a column of smoke up above the tree line. And so again, this repetition, it's the same course, it's the same syllabus, but things varied from one year to the other. Really good opportunity to learn from a master of this environment. Also, I began to learn about the true value of items such as the traditionally hand-knitted Luvika mittens that are made in that part of Sweden, still part of my kit today. I adopted them when I was working up there 20 years ago, and still superb. Also, items such as these Hestra gloves, the Lars Falt guide glove, which Lars had a hand in designing, and I still use to this day as well because they work so well. All of this learning was down to Lars, from working with him in Sweden through the influences of the 1995 conference and how the ripples from that expanded outwards, as well as spending time with him more recently in events like the 2019 Global Bushcraft Symposium and all of the interaction and exchange of knowledge that came about as a result of that. Another key influence on my development as a bushcraft practitioner and instructor was Juha Rankinen. And he was a Swede. He is a Swede with a Finnish name, and he used to come and work on woodlaw courses. He used to lead woodlaw courses. And when I first worked at Woodlaw, I was working a lot with Juha. He had been working at Woodlaw at that point for about 10 years. And he brought with him a certain aesthetic, a clean minimalism in many things, from his kit to his actual techniques, even his communications. Juha could communicate a lot even with just a raised eyebrow. I learned a lot from working with him, and so did others, but more broadly, many more learned from him on courses he led in the UK, as well as through the work that he did through outdoor education, college and school work that he did back in Sweden, and he was a big influence on me. Further great opportunity for cultural exchange and knowledge sharing in this part of the world was Bushcraft Festivalen. This was organised by Jonas Landosi and team, and I was invited 3 times to speak and run workshops in 2016, 2017 and 2018, and meeting Jonas and Matthias Norberg and Mikkel Ackerman and Sally and Kevin and many others at this event was fantastic, as well as some of the elders such as Harry Sepp. And of course it allowed me to reconnect and catch up with a couple of my inspiring mentors, Juha and Lars, of course. Now, changing tack a little bit, there is a strong knife tradition in Sweden and other Nordic countries. There are Sami knives, which are works of art. They're absolutely exquisite, many of them. Some of the older ones are considered priceless, museum pieces. And there is a very strong tradition of making very good quality knives and very good quality craft work around those knives. And good knives of quality steel with flat bevels give rise to the ability to easily turn out things like highly effective feather sticks, for example. But there's a much deeper tradition of handicraft and sloyd in Nordic countries, which includes more than just woodwork. Of course, sloyd contains textile work as well as woodwork as well, but the woodwork is often the element that gets highlighted, particularly in the context of woodcraft, camping, bushcraft, etc. On the wood carving side, one big influence on me was this book, Swedish Carving Techniques by Ville Sundqvist. And you see that in the tools that I use. A Mora carving knife, for example, a Svante Djarv spoon knives, and a Gransfors carving axe, which had input on the design from Ville Sundqvist himself. Also, maybe a little bit more subtly, these tool methods are embedded into our wider practice too. Many of us who teach people probably have included this method of teaching how to pass a knife in our knife safety briefings and our basic knife handling demonstrations and talks. It's part of our basic bushcraft knife safety talks often, but here it is in Sundqvist's book. I'm not suggesting he invented this. People have probably been doing this for many, many years before the book was out. But this teaching was being passed on and being kept alive before the modern bushcraft movement. And that's something to remember. Often we think of these things as just part of bushcraft in the last 10 or 20 years. But these things are more deeply embedded in the practices and the traditions from which they come. Now this is a scan of some pages from one of Ray Mears' earlier books. I bought this before I had any interaction with woodlaw or attended courses. This would have been in the late 1990s, and on reading the book I wanted a knife like the one specified by Mears here. But I didn't know about woodlaw knives then. I didn't know even about Frostmore knives either. So I didn't really know what I was looking for. I just looked at the sizing and the bevel, etc. And then I went down to my local hunting shop, which also sold knives. And this is the closest that I could find. It's a Normark stainless steel knife about the size of your typical bushcraft knife, and I made good use of it. You can see it's well used. Now, it turns out that these knives were made in Finland by Martini, and some of them were branded Normark. Here you can see a knife similar to mine, and these are in blister packs and they are branded Martini. Plus other designs here you can see, including a fish filleting knife, which may now seem quite familiar as a design. But it was quite a radical design that started here with a knife that looked like a very worn butcher's knife. This was originally launched in North America as the Rapala fish and fillet knife, and it became extremely popular, and it still is today. This design of a flexible, thin filleting knife like this is still pretty much the chosen design that most people go for, especially for a filleting knife that they take out in the field with them. Now the connection here is Normark, which is not actually a Nordic company but an American company. It's based in Minnesota, USA, which are the Northlands, the Nor part that this brand mark refers to. And the way that this came about, the connection, is a fishing lure that originated in Finland, made by Lauri Rapala, and they found their way to the United States in the 1950s, and two guys started importing them and distributing them, eventually forming Normark as the company around that activity. So here's some photos of Lauri Rapala, and he started making lures before the Second World War, and he made them for himself originally, so he didn't have to keep rebaiting the hooks on his trolling lines that he had many hundreds of hooks on. As a product, he started making these for some of his friends, and then they started to become popular with fishermen and continued to become more popular through the 1950s. Fast forward to 2025, Rapala Group is now the world's leading fishing tackle company and the global market leader in fishing lures, treble hooks and fishing related knives and tools. Along the way, in 2005, Rapala bought Martini Knives Company, and so full circle there. So there's a lot of connection here, and the influence, even via Normark, is a very strong Nordic influence, both in terms of the knives as well as the actual fishing lures. There's also an equally fascinating history of knife making and brand consolidation around the knives made in Mora, Sweden. And there are people at the GBS 2025 that no doubt have much more insight into this than I do, so I'm going to leave it at that. There are many more knife makers too in the Nordic countries, and these are some of the most internationally recognized knife brands in addition to those that we've already discussed. And there are many smaller makers as well. As a very strong knife culture in the Nordic countries. Another part of Nordic culture that is very strong and has definitely had an influence on me is ski culture. Here again, Lars Falk plays an important role. He introduced me to this style of skiing with Tegsnas wooden skis and Nordic cable bindings, and this was on those first courses that I did with him in 2003 and 2004. Again, another big part of those courses was learning about modes of transport that are appropriate for that part of the world. Another major influence on me in the skiing realm was Brian Desmond. He's an ex-British biathlon champion. He was British military who was working as adventurous training instructor in Norway, and he never left, settling down there after marrying a Norwegian lady. Under Brian's coaching, I was able to improve my Nordic skiing and undertake a number of trips with him, and over the years, trips on my own, and I also used to visit him, and over the years we became good friends. The first trip I did with him was to follow much of the path of the original grouse party of what was part of Operation Freshman, an operation to destroy the Nazi atomic weapons development activities that was centred on the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant in Vermork in the Telemark region. The grouse operation was to insert by parachute an advance party, a four-man team of Norwegians. These were local men already with exceptional outdoor skills. They were further trained in Scotland by UK's Special Operations Executive. The group was led by Jens Anton Poulsen and also included Knut Haugland, Klaus Hellberg and Arnie Shellstrup. The photo here shows Berrenutten Hytte on Songevatten. This is close to where the original grouse party was dropped. They were dropped a little bit further up in rocky ground, and if you've seen the Ray Mears Here is a Telemark show, this is the lake on to which they parachuted for that show, and it's at the southern end of the Hardanger Vidda. This is another part of the same trip on a long strip lake called Bittdalen. Gives you some indication of the harshness of that environment. And this is the Norsk Hydro plant at Vermork, the hydro plant. You can see the pipes coming down for the hydroelectric part of the plant. And the problem with assaulting this was it was on the other side of a very deep ravine, and the only way across it was this bridge. And it looks a little bit like something out of Where Eagles Dare. And indeed, they did make a similar film in the 1960s, which isn't great. The reality of the situation is even more fantastic and amazing than perhaps the Hollywood movie version. But this was what they were confronted with potentially in attacking the hydro plant, and there was a machine gun emplacement at the end of the bridge. And so they needed another way of getting in, and they crossed the ravine further down, the assault team that eventually did the assault on the hydro plant. You can read a lot more about these actions, you can watch shows about them. It's not really the point of this presentation, but the point is that I found all of this activity highly inspirational, both in terms of the bravery, but also the outdoor skills that these people held. This is next to the memorial at Vermork, naming the guys that I mentioned as well as the guys in the assault group. And in learning about the heroes of Telemark, I also learned about Helge Ingstad. He wrote a book called Pelsjegerliv, which translates to Fur Hunter's Life or Fur Hunter Life. And Ingstad was originally a lawyer by profession, but he was an avid outdoorsman, and he sold his law practice that was successful. He had a successful career, but he sold it and he moved to Canada to be a trapper in 1926. During his time in Canada, he learned trapping from locals. He lived as a trapper on his own some of the time, and also travelled with a group of Inuit known as the Caribou Eaters. And the book Pelsjegerliv was written about his time in Canada and became a bestseller in Norway. Now back to Operation Grouse. Long story short, they ended up having to live in the mountains over the winter. There were huts, but there was very little food in them because of the Second World War and limited supplies, and people weren't really going out for leisure. And they also had to be wary of German patrols. So these guys were really struggling for food. And after months on the ground with little food, they were becoming malnourished. This is a screenshot from a movie that was made not long after the Second World War that actually includes some of the original Grouse Party as cast. The scene here illustrates that they were attempting to use a lichen known as reindeer moss. While the favourite food of the reindeer that live in the mountains, lichen cannot be digested directly by the human digestive system. It needs significant pre-processing and has a relatively low yield in terms of calories. But as I say, they were struggling for food, and so they tried to make use of this. But eventually they were able to actually shoot one of the reindeer that had been pretty elusive up until this point. And it was Jens Anton Poulsen who managed to shoot the first reindeer. And he said the day before Christmas, when I went out and I was able to shoot the first reindeer, it was very, very important. We needed that meat. Ingstad had spent 4 years as a trapper in Canada, living with the Caribou people who live only on reindeer, and I knew most of what he had written by heart. We ate every morsel of the animal in Indian fashion. One can live entirely on meat. One gets vitamin C by eating the stomach with its contents. These contents mixed with blood are a delicacy. So here is a case of military survival being reliant on anthropological observations that were written by a fellow countryman who had witnessed those things being used in Canada, and Paulson and his team were able to transpose that across to reindeer in Norway. And reindeer for Tarandus, caribou, and reindeer are very, very closely related, and so they were able to just use this information. And so again, a really interesting crossover between areas of skill. Something that Lisa talked about was military survival and leisure and outdoor skills, and some skills that you might use in your leisure in peacetime may become important survival skills in wartime. These are not necessarily fixed in where they sit in that Venn diagram, so to speak. And if you want to read Ingstad's work in English, the book is actually called The Land of Feast and Famine, and you can get that on Amazon. Another Nordic man who ended up trapping in Canada was Erik Munsterhelm, and he was born in Finland but lived in Canada since 1928. Much of his life had been spent as a northern trapper, prospector and geologist once he was there. In addition to 8 books in Swedish and Finnish, he published some books in English about his northern experiences. After 2 years working on a railroad in the California desert, he quit and followed his urge to head north. He made his way to Edmonton, Alberta, to look for work. There he met a fellow immigrant, a Swede named Carl, and they decided to try their hand at trapping in far northern Saskatchewan. It was the beginning of a long series of adventures in the north for Erik and for his companion. And he wrote a book particularly about this early part when they decided to become trappers and moved into the country. They built canoes, even though they didn't really know how to build canoes. They travelled upriver, and they even travelled up the Porcupine River, and that's all in the book The Wind and the Caribou, which is a great read. If you can get hold of a copy of that book, it's not in print anymore, but if you can get hold of a copy of that book secondhand at a reasonable price, I'd thoroughly recommend it. I personally found it quite inspirational. And indeed, the Porcupine River starts in a lake, Selwyn Lake. I've coloured it in red here. There, it starts there right on the 60th parallel, the border between the Northwest Territories and northern Saskatchewan, and then it runs southwards from there. And in 2023, I took a group there along with Ray Goodwin to run that river, and it was quite the fantastic experience. You first have to go to Saskatoon, then travel north to a small landing strip called Points North, and from there you take a float plane even further into the wilderness. So it's a very remote setting, and it is well into the land that's known as the land of the little sticks, because all of the spruce trees and other conifers there really grow very small. They grow very slowly. They can get bigger, but generally they stay quite small because they grow very slowly, because the growing season is quite short and the winters are so harsh, and it is known colloquially as the land of little sticks. It's an absolutely fantastic river to paddle. Many rapids that are paddleable, that are an absolute joy to paddle. Also some serious falls and rapids that you need to portage around. Rugged terrain, not very well travelled. It's one of the most pristine places that I've ever been to, and it really made me think when I was there that much of our natural world was like this at one point before we spoiled it, before we sullied it. And it really makes you want to preserve what we still have. And what a wonderful journey. Absolutely amazing terrain, and again in a Hilleberg tent, Swedish tent. Now back to the Norwegian resistance in the Second World War. Just one more thing on this really. Knut Hauklid was a Norwegian who had also joined Norwegian Independent Company No. 1, known as Company Linge, in 1941, and trained in the UK by special operations executive for sabotage operations. Now, in this photograph on the left here, note the hut in the background. This is a hut that they built up in the north of the Setisel Mountains so that it was hard for the Germans to detect them because nobody knew that the hut was there. He was deputy commander of the Gunnerside Group who undertook the sabotage operation on the Vermock heavy water plant in February 1943, and he was one of a few men who then stayed in the area, hiding in the mountains to carry out further operations, which ultimately included the sinking of a ferry on Tintia or Lake Tyn. The hut in the background, as I say, is one that they built camouflaged against a hillside with the rocks of the area. It was not on any maps, and so it was difficult for the occupying German forces to find it. This is a sister ferry, the SF Ammonia, to the one that was sunk, which can still be visited on the lake. More interesting to me than visiting the ferry, though, was to go up into the mountains to see where these guys had been and where they had operated. So a friend and I went up to Haukeliseter Fjellstu, which is by the road, which basically demarks the line between the southern Hardangervidda and the northern Setistel Mountains. And we stayed there to start our journey. This is the view from there. It's an absolutely fantastic environment. Some quite imposing looking mountains in the southern part of the vista there, but there is a route through. There's another hut about 25k down that we then stayed at, and then we had to try and find the hut, Bamsebu, as it was called after their dog Bamse, in this landscape. So this is where the hut that Knut Hauklid and his companions built their hut, and you can see why it was difficult to find. But we did have some good maps, and unlike World War II, the hut is now marked on the maps. It still takes a bit of navigational skill to find it in winter though, but find it we did, and here is the hut. Now it has a fascia board on it now. It's still painted in a camouflage pattern to try and make it blend in against the hillside in the background, and of course it was almost entirely covered in snow when we were there. But this is that hut that was in the background of that black and white photo with Knut Hauklid in there. And so I was really inspired by all of that, both in terms of the outdoor skill and the mental fortitude that those guys had. And I've been back to Norway on ski tours multiple times. I'm not in any way an expert skier, but I do enjoy the freedom to explore the winter environment that skiing allows, and I just take it steady, I'm careful, and I love exploring the Nordic winter terrain by this means. Winter can be challenging, and that's part of the appeal actually. I've been out in some fantastic weather, like in this photograph. I've also been out in some brutal weather, and I'm always appreciative of finding a mountain hut, for example, even if I have to dig my way into it like this one here. And this brings me on to huts and hut culture. This represents a strong connection to nature and a love for simple living. In Nordic countries, there's a deep-rooted tradition of enjoying a cozy and simple cabin life, it seems, often in remote or natural settings. And this culture is characterized by, I think, a connection with nature, a sense of community, maybe even going there and sharing the experience with family, and a focus on the simple pleasures in life. And my experience with huts, other than, private huts, is the DNT hut system in Norway, and it's absolutely fantastic. These huts are nicer than some people's houses that I've been into, and it's just amazing to me how well everyone respects them. They look after them, they leave them clean and tidy. Most of the payment for most of the huts is done on an honesty system, both in terms of your overnight stay as well as any food that you use, and everyone respects it. It's such a fantastic system and such a strong culture around it that if you put bothies and huts in other parts of the world, you don't immediately get people relating to it like that. There's a really strong culture in the Nordic countries around using huts and open lean-tos that are situated out in wilderness areas, and it's fantastic. And it gets you into some amazing places with some amazing views and some amazing surrounding countryside, and I've always enjoyed that part of the Nordic culture as well. Now this is in the mountains above a small village called Morgedal in the Telemark region of Norway, and here we are exploring the hills around there and the forests around there, and we were with a guy called Olav Kjetil Bang, and he's a dog musher, lives not that far from this part of the world, and he is an excellent skier. He's a very, very good skier, and it was good to be out with him. But there is a strong tradition of skiing in this part of Norway, and it goes back a long way. You can see a couple of things here. You can see the traditional ski shoes, like the Sami ski shoes with the upturned toe so that they could hook into the ski binding. You also can see that at that point they typically used a single ski pole for heading down the mountains, and some of the traditional garb there as well, in terms of the smocks that go down below the waist, a belt, etc., etc. And you can see that influence in clothing still pulls through into modern outdoor clothing and modern bushcraft clothing, and some of the clothing that I use, for example. And I've learnt it, second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand from people, but you can see those strong traditions of practical clothing there, as well as elements of the ski tradition. And one of the most famous sons of Morgedal is surely Sondre Norheim, and he is considered the father of telemark skiing. Like many in Morgedal, he was a keen skier. He was an expert skier, but he made some key innovations such as more secure bindings, shorter skis with side cuts for better turning, and he was a skiing master and combined ordinary skiing with ski jumping and slalom. Indeed, he won the first national skiing competition in 1868, and there is a museum in Morgedal which covers skiing and ski culture and also highlights the influences of Sondre Norheim. Traditional ski bindings were made from roots or withies, like this one shown in the ski museum in Morgedal, and one of Norheim's innovations was to create a second loop that went around the heel so that the ski retention and control was better. And that's fundamentally that type of ski binding that I learned on with the Nordic squared off toe and the cable binding that goes around the heel, so that you've got a really strong connection with the ski, but you've got free heels. You can lift your heel as well for skiing cross country, and that also basically gave rise to telemark skiing. Norheim effectively invented telemark skiing, and this then became a much more popular pastime over time, and we take these words for granted now. They're in common parlance, but they came directly from the Nordic ski culture. So ski is Norwegian from the Old Norse word which means a cleft wood or cleft stick or stick of wood, and actually also refers to the actual ski that people made from a split piece of wood or what have you. Slalom also comes from Norwegian, meaning literally sloping track. Another expert skier who was from Morgedal was Olav Bjarland, and he was already a ski champion. In 1909, Bjarland, together with 5 others, were invited to France to compete with the best skiers of Europe. And on this trip, Bjarland, by chance, met Roald Amundsen. And Amundsen was already a successful explorer, and he invited Bjarland to join his forthcoming expedition to the North Pole. And they left for that in June 1910, still believing that they were heading to the North Pole. They were actually heading towards the South Pole for a race for the South Pole against Captain Scott, Robert Falcon Scott. And Bjarland was a skilled carpenter as well as a skilled skier. And on the trip south, ahead of the pole attempt, he managed to reduce the prefabricated sledges bought in Oslo from 88 kilograms apiece to just 22 kilograms without significantly reducing their strength. This is quite a famous photograph of Amundsen at the South Pole, and they reached there on December 14th, 1911, and this photograph was actually taken by Olav Bjarland. Now, let's go back a little bit. From 1903 to 1906, Amundsen also led the first expedition to successfully traverse the Northwest Passage between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And the Northwest Passage was something that had fired the imagination, particularly of Western explorers, for probably several centuries at this point, going right back to the times of the Hudson's Bay Company and thinking about whether or not there were passages through towards the Pacific from the west of the Hudson's Bay, and nobody had ever found it. Mackenzie had gone up the Mackenzie River thinking that he might be finding a northwest passage across land going from Great Slave Lake, but nobody had actually found the northwest passage by this point, and Amundsen was the first expedition to successfully traverse all the way through, and it took them 3 years, and they spent 2 winters on King William Island, during which time they visited with and learned from local Netsilik Inuits, and they became good friends. They became familiar with the language. The Norwegian crew could speak the local language, and they would then exchange ideas and skills. They would exchange material goods, and they had frequent visits with Amundsen and his crew, and Amundsen and the crew also made frequent visits to the local Inuit habitations. Amundsen and his team learned many survival skills from the Inuit, including building igloos. The Inuit taught Amundsen how to prepare the sledge runners so that they would slide effectively in extremely cold conditions. And Amundsen also noted seeing, and this is in quotes, seeing the Eskimo women harnessed and pulling the sledges. And the reason that they were doing this was to encourage the sled dogs to run in conditions with poor visibility. And it's interesting that during the race for the South Pole, the expert skier Olav Bjarland was often used as a forerunner so that the dogs had something to run after. So this again was something that Amundsen and his team learned from the Inuit during the time with them on the Northwest Passage expedition. Amundsen and his crew also learned the value of Inuit fur clothing, which was lighter and performed better than heavy wool garments. All this, plus a knowledge of the value of raw meat in preventing scurvy, significantly contributed to Amundsen's subsequent success in reaching the South Pole and returning to tell the tale. So he learnt from indigenous peoples, as did some of the other people that we've talked about, like Ingstad. And of course, the Nordic area has its own indigenous people and culture, the Sami. Traditionally reindeer herders, and they traditionally lived a nomadic life over the lands that now span Norway, Sweden, Finland and Russia up in the north of Fennoscandia there. This photograph is a colorized photograph from around 1900, and it shows the traditional conical dwelling similar to ones that were used by many native peoples, especially around the boreal forest. In the Nordic countries, these are known variously as kota, lavu or lavo, depending on the language. Further afield, these shapes are also referred to as chums or teepees. And we still see those conical shapes in the environment today. This is a photograph from northern Sweden with the tent teepees, which used to be called moskoselkatan. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on Sami culture. I've had some experience of it, but my exposure to the Sami and their culture was largely through working in the north of Sweden, and in particular I had the great pleasure of knowing this lady, Britt-Marie Labat. She was small, but certainly a force of nature. When we were working together, we had lots of laughs, and I learned a lot just sitting, speaking with her, drinking coffee on breaks and in the evenings, sometimes late into the evenings, asking her questions about their traditional life and how the traditional life had changed in modern times, particularly with the advent of things like snow machines and quad bikes, ATVs. Their nomadic life had disappeared, but they still retained many skills, particularly in this part of Sweden. And even, her handicrafts were fantastic. I don't have any photographs of them, but she would often bring handicrafts to share and show and talk about how she made them, whether that's scrimshaw work, whether that was sewing of traditional garments from reindeer skins. And she also would teach how to make simple things like the Sami pan breads, which are similar to chapati. Now, this is a book that Lars Falt pretty much forced me to buy when we were in a bookshop in Kiruna, northern Sweden. It's a book on traditional Sami fire skills, and despite this being in Swedish, I've learned as much as I possibly can from it, partly through having parts of it translated. And there are many skills from small to large here, and we tried a lot of these techniques, particularly the winter skills, on annual trips to the north. Even after I finished working with Lars and Woodlaw in the north, I continued to make trips for many years to the north, annual trips with some friends of mine who were keen on these skills and the environment as well. And we would practice skills when we were there. So again, repeated practice of skills, applying them in different places and in different contexts. And one of the things that we did when we used to go up there before we went into the bush was we would go to the Sami butcher in Kiruna, Torneus, and get meats. So we would get minced reindeer meat, we'd get minced moose, we'd get some stewing meat as well, and we'd use that for our supplies on our trips. And of course, being the temperature it is up there, it would freeze and it would stay frozen until we cooked it. So it was a really good way of using local resources and having really good quality supplies for our trips that we would do when we headed off into the bush for a couple of weeks. Another place I was exposed to some of the culture, the Sami culture, and particularly the craft culture, was at Carl Venberg, the Sami handicraft store in Kiruna. And here it's not tourist tat like you get in airport shops and whatnot. Here you've got genuine crafts, exquisitely made. And this area, particularly just around the Kiruna area, was a stronghold of knife making for a long time as well, and that tradition continues. And you'd also see amazing scrimshaw work on reindeer antler, the woven bands that I referred to earlier in the presentation, that some of which were used as shoe bands, some of which were used as belts, some of which were used for going around garments, lots of different things that the woven materials were used for. And the traditional Sami wooden cup, the guksi, known variously as kuksa in Finnish or kasa in Swedish, and that's now more widely adopted into bushcraft circles, even by those who have never been to the north. And people commonly use the Finnish word for these days, kuksa, but remember that is a specific word from in a specific language. Now, bringing us on to this, the nature. This is a huge inspiration. It also sets the context for the relevant skills and knowledge that we've been talking about. There is quite a large amount of undamaged, untrammeled nature in the Nordic countries, more than there is, say, in Britain. Certainly, it's a lower population density. They still have large mammals like moose, bear, wolves, lynx, which we don't have in the UK anymore. And so the nature itself is quite inspirational. It also, again, I can see the parallels both with the animal species as well as the tree species with North America. And I can see why people like Munsterhelm and Ingstad felt relatively at home going to Canada, having spent time in nature in the Nordic countries. There are great parallels there, even though they're not the same species, particularly with the trees, but there are parallel species which sit in the same ecological niches. And in spending time in nature in the Nordic countries, you also gain experience that's relevant to going further afield. But it's not just about practical experience, it's also just about the sense of awe and wonder in these places. Northern Lights here, like looking up into a cathedral. This is the image that I've had as the header on my website for many years. It was such a spectacular evening of Northern Lights on this particular occasion. But I've had many such experiences in the north, particularly in the winter. Then there's just the landscape, and these images don't really need me to say very much. And it doesn't have to be winter. I've talked about winter a lot, but it doesn't have to be winter. I've been there other times of the year. I've been there hiking, and there's some absolutely stunning landscapes. They're rugged. They're often remote. They're often quite harsh with the weather changes that you get sometimes, but amazing places to spend time in. And this was one occasion we were doing a hiking trip off trails. We were doing a bit of a recce for a potential course that in the end we never ran in that area, but myself and a couple of colleagues, we just had a fantastic time. And it was a little bit like being a kid. We didn't have a massive agenda. We didn't have a route that we really wanted to cover. We just wanted to go and explore. And I had lots of experiences as a kid where we wandered around the forests, particularly previously when I lived in North Wales. We wandered around the forest just with no real fixed agenda other than wandering around, seeing what we could see. And we did this on this trip that lasted a week or so, and it was fantastic, just exploring around, looking at the resources, finding resources in the forest, making use of them, making use of the seasonal fruits, the seasonal berries that were around at that time of year. It was absolutely wonderful, and even though it was quite cold and wet at times, we just had such a great time. Just lovely being in that environment. Conditions can be harsher, of course. I've alluded to this, harsh conditions in the mountains in Norway, but we've also had some cold conditions, yet really serene, deep winter trips in northern Sweden in the forest. And this image also shows that we began to experiment with using North American equipment such as the snow trekker tents, Black River toboggans, snowshoes, etc. We were already quite familiar with skis and pulks and lavus by this point, and so we were like, okay, well, we're still operating in northern Sweden. It's an environment that we're familiar with. Let's start looking at some of these North American types of equipment and see how they perform in a similar environment, and let's get familiar with those. And that's what we did over a number of years, and we spent quite a lot of years doing that, to the extent that we then were confident to go later and make trips in Canada in the winter using that type of equipment. And ultimately I have joined forces with Lure of the North in Canada to run winter trips there. But one of the things with northern Sweden, again, was the temperatures. It's not always this cold, but the temperatures can easily get right down into that blue zone, and you have to be tight with your skills. You have to be tight with your management of your personal admin, your personal equipment, your clothing, and it really, really matters in this environment, particularly when the temperatures become low. In his opening speech, Johan Skulman talked about operating in situations where the tolerance for mistakes was zero, and certainly when you get down to below minus 30 degrees Celsius, the tolerance for mistakes there really becomes zero as well. You really can't afford to make mistakes, get your hands too cold or what have you at that temperature, because it's very, very difficult to come back from. And that instills a certain discipline that operating in milder, more temperate regions just can't do. But we had great times exploring those, working on skills every winter, repetition, as I say, building types of things that Lars had shown us how to do, working on those skills, building lean-tos and combining them with newing fires and those type of things, and just really, really understanding how those things worked, and just absolutely fantastic to go back and keep doing that. And it was the Nordic landscape that allowed us to do that, and it's in the Nordic landscape in which those skills really come to the fore. The landscape sets the context. Also, I filmed elements of my online elementary wilderness bushcraft course up there, the winter elements, so the Quincy and some of the other elements that we filmed were all filmed up there in northern Sweden, in the area that I had grown to really love and know quite well. Also, in making these journeys, we tested out some prototype equipment, particularly a prototype smock that Ian had basically taken a design from the Conovers book that's freely available in the back of the Conovers Snow Walker's Companion, and that's kind of the Bible of this type of journeying with snowshoes and toboggans and heated tents. And we wanted to add some other features that suited us in the way that we traveled and operating in the places that we operated. And so we used these opportunities to do this. And I've talked about this more on a video in my YouTube channel, and you can watch that there. And then it ended up with us coming out with a really, really good garment that we still use to this day. And again, that's down to the not just the influence of the Conovers, but also the influence of working in that northern Nordic environment. Now, this is the image I chose to close out my book, Wilderness Axe Skills and Campcraft, and it encapsulates what I love about the boreal forest, the sense of adventure that going there brings, the sense of remoteness, the pristine environment and the nature that's there, and the confidence that the skills that we teach and share closer to home bring to people, and that they can then go and apply in more remote wild places. And that to me is one of the advantages that you get from going to these wild places, then, is that then it really consolidates your skill set that you can then, for me personally, that I can then bring back and teach people closer to home with the context of having used these skills in the Nordic countries as well as further afield in places like Canada. But there's a great interlinking between all of that. And so let me end with some closing thoughts. This presentation has highlighted the various aspects of the Nordic Way that have inspired me, had an influence on my practice and my skills, as well as perhaps having had a wider influence that we can see through the bushcraft world. And in closing this talk, I don't really want to summarize what I've already talked about. I think I've talked about them in quite a vivid way already, but I'd rather draw out some lessons that can be applied more widely to open up experiences and learning wherever you travel and spend time, but probably still filtering some of that Nordic way through all of this. So, learn from others. This is something I saw in Lars's work. This is something you see in Amundsen's progression through, not just from the Northwest Passage expedition, but also going back to his first trip to the South Pole when he was with the Belgian expedition, and they had to fend off scurvy, and the way that the American doctor on that trip was able to help fend off scurvy through the use of raw meat, and then through his experience on the Northwest Passage through to successfully completing the South Pole. You see it in what Munsterhelm did in learning from local people and from experience ultimately, and also particularly Helge Ingstad in learning from local trappers as well as the caribou eaters. Study local methods, especially native or deeply ingrained methods. And this overlaps with the point that I just made, but it's worth highlighting this, that you study local methods and ones that are really ingrained in how people live and work in those environments. Study those first and take what's useful and integrate it fully and integrate it into your practice. Don't just go, oh yeah, that's quite interesting, I'll use that when I need to. Integrate it into your practice. Practice those skills. See if you can apply them yourself. See if you can apply them in the context of what you're doing. Remember that skills live in the context of the place. Okay, the skills that we've talked about, and I haven't talked about a lot, but I've alluded to quite a lot of skills, they really, really make sense in that environment. But they also, in practicing those skills, particularly in a harsh environment, make all of your skills better. They make your technique tighter. They make your self-administration and self-care tighter, and particularly in environments where you can't afford to make mistakes. And that is one of the values of going to these type of places. Also, don't try to innovate until you understand what already works. I see this a lot where people, I show them a technique, and before they've even tried it, they're suggesting different ways of doing it because in their own mind, they can't see themselves being able to do what I've just shown them. You know, bow drill's a classic example, but there are many other examples. And I would suggest before you start trying to find different ways of doing things, just try what you've been shown or try what you've seen other people doing and really start to understand what's going on. If you need to ask questions, ask questions. Why do you do it this way? Why don't you do it that way? Understand why things are done in a particular way. Doesn't mean to say that you can't innovate. Innovation happens over time by people understanding what's already happening and making changes and coming up with better ways. Again, in his opening speech, Johan talked about taking the best of the traditional skills and the best of modern thinking and practice and maybe even equipment and combining them so that we have the best of both worlds. And I firmly believe in that too. But before you start to make changes, understand what's already in place and build experience gradually. Don't overstep the mark. Go out, layer on experience, push yourself a bit harder, try different things, varied experience, varied practice, as I say. Try things under different circumstances and you will get a depth and resilience of skill set over time by doing that. And then also reflective practice. Think about what you've done when you've done a trip or even part of a trip or part of a camp out. Think about what worked, what didn't work. We often spend a lot of time thinking about things when they don't go right or they don't go to plan, and we reflect on that and what can we do better next time, and that's valuable. But also think about what did go right. Did it go right because you had everything all squared away, your planning was perfect, everything was impeccable, or were you just lucky? Did you just get lucky and it worked out well? Were you lucky with the weather even though you were relatively ill prepared? Were you taking risks but they just didn't come to a point where you were injured or what have you? Think about what went well, what went successfully, but should we have had other things in place? Should I have had more experience in this area before I attempted this? Think about those things as well. Reflective practice is super important. And then remember that experience and confidence over time opens possibilities. What at one point might seem like completely unobtainable in terms of your skill set, over time then starts becoming within your skill set, and adventures that maybe you thought were outside of your potential possibilities then become within your abilities, and what might seem maybe a misadventure if you tried it when you were less skilled now becomes an adventure that you can competently and strongly undertake once you become more skilled and more experienced. So remember that to expand your horizons as you go as well. And also cross-fertilize when appropriate. You see that right across the board in what we've talked about in this presentation. You see people taking Nordic skills to North America. You see people looking at anthropologically what people were doing in North America and applying it in certain situations back in the Second World War, for example. You also see what we did, British people going to Norway, cross-fertilizing with Nordic skills, or going to Sweden, cross-fertilizing with the Nordic skills there. But then also once we became comfortable there, we were then cross-fertilizing with American ideas of how to travel with snowshoe, toboggan, etc. So cross-fertilize when appropriate, because that can give you a greater depth and granularity to your skill set and your understanding as well. And just remember, you never stop learning. There's always more to learn. There's always more conditions to experience that you haven't experienced before. There's always different circumstances that you're going to experience that you haven't experienced before. And there are always people that know things that you don't. So be curious, keep learning, and keep sharing what you already know. And that will be reciprocated from people that know things that you don't know as well. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope you found that inspiring. I hope you found some of the technical details interesting. I hope you found the historical elements interesting. There's lots of links below that you can use, and I hope you can delve into those areas in a bit more depth as well if you want to, as well as refer back to some of my earlier videos. And I look forward to seeing you on another presentation or video before too long. Take care.